The world has always excelled at pretending its darkest corners don't exist. History classes skim politely over them, museums turn the evidence into sterile displays, and movies decorate everything with too much eyeliner and a tragic love subplot. Ancient Rome is no exception. Its gladiators get poster treatment, its emperors get meme-worthy quotes, but the female slaves who kept the empire running, they barely get a footnote unless you know where to look. Imagine waking tomorrow to find yourself trending worldwide, not for your creativity, not for your achievements, but because someone has just sold your freedom to the highest bidder. That is the reality women faced in Rome's slave markets, where lives were rearranged like used pottery. Think you could stomach medieval justice? Spoiler, most modern people would faint before the real show even starts. So, before we start, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And since this is meant to be a shared nighttime ritual, post your location and your local time below. As the room softens around you, lean back and allow this story to unfold an experience unlike anything you've listened to until now. Somewhere in the noise of history lies a silence too raw to ignore, the silence of women stripped of names, waiting for what comes next. The slave market in Rome is not some back alley scene. It sits in the open, loud, and unapologetic. Men stroll through with purses jangling, and women stand on platforms, inspected like cattle. Buyers pinch arms, prod teeth, or tug at hair. Some girls are forced to wear placards around their necks, describing their supposed skills, or more chillingly, their defects. Historians still argue whether some were made to stand naked, but the fact that it is even debated tells you everything about the casual cruelty at play. A mainstream fact that gets lost in the drama is that Rome's economy relied heavily on slavery, with an estimated 1/3 of the city's population being enslaved at its height. That's not just a side hustle, that's the engine. Yet tucked inside those statistics are individual lives, each dragged from somewhere else. Gaul, Africa, the East. Imagine a teenager hearing Latin for the first time as shouted insults, not poetry. A girl raised on Greek lullabies suddenly locked in a pen, listening to buyers mock her accent. One quirky detail? There are records of slaves being packaged with warranties, almost like defective goods returnable within a certain time. Some contracts allowed a buyer to bring a slave back if she turned out to be sick or infertile, which is horrifying, but also disturbingly bureaucratic. Rome, after all, loved paperwork nearly as much as conquest. The first sale often marked the end of someone's identity. A Celtic girl named Bridget becomes Claudia's property. Her accent is corrected until it fades. Her gods are mocked until she forgets them. Sometimes a tattoo or brand is burned into her skin, a permanent reminder she's inventory, not family. Buyers laugh about whether she'd be better as a field hand or a concubine, while she stands there with no say in the matter. Here's the cruel paradox. Many Romans prided themselves on civilization, law, and order, yet their definition of order included turning human beings into furniture. The Senate debated military campaigns for weeks, but the lives of thousands of enslaved women decided in minutes at an auction block. And the market is just the beginning. Once purchased, a woman's entire future depends on who holds the receipt. If she's unlucky, her owner is petty, cruel, or bored. If she's lucky, well, lucky means only being forced into backbreaking labor with the hope of one day buying her freedom. Even then, the price could be impossible to reach. Picture the scene. A young girl, probably no older than 14, shivers under the Roman sun. The auctioneer waves a stick, rattling off her supposed virtues. A wealthy matron sniffs that her hair is too coarse. A soldier laughs and asks if she's strong enough to haul amphorae of wine. No one asks what she wants because her wants have been deleted. And yet, behind the blank stares, there's resistance. She memorizes faces. She notices escape routes. She clings to the memory of her mother's voice. Survival is its own form of rebellion. Historians still argue whether slaves in markets ever dared to bite or scratch their buyers. But the very rumor of it suggests people hoped someone, somewhere, had the courage to make the Romans bleed. The cruelty of the marketplace lingers like a shadow. Every cheerful Roman dinner party, every marble column, every fancy bathhouse is partly financed by the suffering of those sold in its squares. You won't see their names in the history books, but you can almost hear their silence if you stand in those ancient ruins long enough. And yet, the auction is not the end of their story. It's only the prologue. The true horror unfolds once the gates of the villa close behind them, when the world outside forgets they exist, and the rules of ownership take over. What happens inside those walls is darker still. The villa looks grand from the outside, columns gleaming, courtyards echoing with fountains, frescoes so vivid they trick the eye into believing the gods themselves have descended for lunch. But the beauty is a mask. Step inside and follow the footsteps of a newly purchased slave girl, and the illusion crumbles fast. The marble floors feel cold against bare feet. The air smells of roasted meat for the master's table, though she knows none of it is for her. She is herded past mosaics of dolphins and battleships, as if the artistry might soften the blow of being told she now belongs to this household. It doesn't. In Rome, slaves were absorbed into a domus, the private household, and the household was a machine. The paterfamilias, the male head, was the engineer, and everything ran to serve him. Female slaves became the silent gears of this machine. Cooks, cleaners, tutors, wet nurses, even hairstylists tasked with sculpting the elaborate coils that Roman matrons adored. One mainstream fact worth underscoring: wealthy Roman women often had entire squads of enslaved girls just to maintain their appearance. Imagine needing 3 people just to hold your mirrors. For the enslaved, it meant long days bending over braziers, grinding grain until fingers bled, or standing for hours behind a mistress who complained about every hairpin being crooked. The work was endless, and the line between personal servant and personal prisoner barely existed. If a girl burned bread or knotted a braid too tightly, the punishment could be instant: a slap, a whip, or being locked in a cellar. Historians still argue whether slaves in high-born villas had better lives compared to those in fields. The argument is grotesque, as though reduced suffering should be considered privilege. Pain doesn't become pleasant simply because it's framed by painted walls. One quirky, almost absurd detail: some villas employed slaves specifically to stand at dinner parties and shoo flies away from the guests. Yes, that was a job. Imagine dedicating your entire existence to waving away insects while people feast 3 feet in front of you. Romans loved to joke about their luxurious living, but for the girl with the fly swatter, there was nothing funny about it. And then there were the sleeping arrangements. The mistress had her chamber adorned with ivory and silks. The daughter of the house had cushions embroidered with tiny cupids. The slave girl? She curled up in storage rooms, corners of kitchens, or if she was trusted, near the mistress's bed, to be on call at all hours. Privacy was a concept erased from her vocabulary. Even sleep, the last refuge of the body, was rationed out, depending on how much her owners demanded. Whispers followed her through the halls. Other enslaved women, seasoned veterans of this captivity, might offer fragments of advice. Do not meet the master's eyes unless he speaks first. Or, if the mistress favors you, stay close, sometimes that's safer. These were survival strategies, passed like heirlooms, though they protected nothing more than scraps of dignity. The truth was unavoidable. She was property. If the mistress decided the girl's talents would be better used as a wet nurse, she would be given another woman's child to feed. If the master thought she looked graceful carrying a wine jug, she might find herself paraded at dinner for the entertainment of guests. Her body was a tool, repurposed at whim. The villa itself, ironically, trapped the enslaved in luxury they could never touch. Marble baths? She scrubbed them but never soaked. Gardens perfumed with roses? She trimmed them but never lingered. Banquets? She tasted the food only when commanded to check for poison. Each day she brushed against wealth without absorbing even a crumb of it. The contrast was crueler than outright deprivation, like being locked in a bakery but forbidden to eat. One cannot underestimate the psychological warfare here. To survive, the enslaved girl had to learn to smile on cue, to nod when insulted, to anticipate needs before anyone voiced them. She became invisible and hypervisible all at once, unseen as a person, glaringly present as an object. Historians still argue whether slaves form bonds of loyalty with their masters. Some ancient texts gush about faithful slaves who followed their owners into exile. But one has to wonder how much of that so-called loyalty was just coerced dependence, the only strategy left when every other escape was barred. And yet, humor survives even here. Romans were notorious for gossip, and slave girls often heard more than they should. Imagine polishing a floor while senators' wives complain loudly about their husbands' mistresses, information far above your pay grade, but impossible not to absorb. Some slaves even became unofficial family spies, carrying tales between mistress and master. This accidental power could be dangerous. Gossip might save you from punishment one day and condemn you the next. The villa closes its gates at night. Torches flicker along the walls, and silence falls in the marble atriums. But inside those walls, silence is not peace. For the enslaved women, night often means more orders, more humiliations, and the gnawing knowledge that morning will start it all again. Rome praised itself as the beacon of order and civilization, yet in those villas, the line between elegance and cruelty blurred into a single suffocating reality. And what waits behind the curtain of domestic duties? The villa hides more than labor. It hides the darker arena where ownership of bodies turns into something even less spoken of pleasure mixed with punishment, intimacy redefined as domination. If the household was already a machine of control, then the bedchamber was the cruelest cog of all. The bedchamber is not marked with a skull above the door, but for many enslaved women, it might as well be. Labor in kitchens and courtyards grinds the body down, yet at least there the task has an endpoint. The master's gaze, on the other hand, is endless. When he gestures, a woman is expected to appear. When he desires, she cannot refuse. Rome dresses this up as household custom, as natural order, but what it really amounts to is sanctioned violation written into the walls of the villa. Roman law makes the cruelty explicit. A slave is not a person in the eyes of the courts. She is property. Any child she bears is also property, automatically belonging to the master's household. That means her body is both vessel and resource, doubling as workforce and womb. The chilling fact here, entire lineages of Roman families expanded not through marriage alone, but through children born to enslaved women, quietly folded into the estate's tally of assets. Historians still argue whether owners felt any affection toward these children or whether they treated them as just another investment. Affection sounds noble in theory, but in practice it often meant little more than not selling the child too quickly. The contradictions pile up. Romans boasted of their refined tastes in poetry and art, yet the same men recited odes while using women as little more than furniture. A mainstream fact worth noting, the poet Martial casually references slave girls in his epigrams, usually as objects of ridicule or conquest. That literature survives because Roman society found it amusing, which says more about them than about the women erased inside those jokes. Sometimes female slaves were paraded as favorites. A wealthy master might dress one in silk, give her jewelry, even seat her near him at banquets. To outsiders, this looked like indulgence. But for the woman herself, it was a trap. Her privileges lasted only as long as his amusement. If the mistress of the house grew jealous, or if the master became bored, the same woman could be stripped, beaten, or sold without warning. A life built on someone else's whims is no life at all. Quirky detail. Some Roman writers mention that perfume sellers often thrived near slave markets because wealthy men bought oils and scents to mask the odor of their new acquisitions. It's grotesque consumerism at its peak, turning human ownership into a shopping spree complete with accessories. Imagine walking home with both a new servant and a bottle of imported myrrh, as if the pairing made sense. Humor, though rare, sometimes surfaced in the bitter form of survival. Picture a slave girl preparing a master's bath and muttering just loudly enough for the other servants to hear, "Better wash him well, or Jupiter himself will come down and scold me." It's not rebellion, but it's a reminder that wit remained alive, even under suffocating control. Romans liked to joke about their gods meddling in daily affairs. Enslaved women twisted that humor into veiled protest. Punishment was always the shadow lurking behind unwanted resistance. Refuse the master? Unthinkable. Even the suspicion of reluctance could lead to the whip, to confinement in chains, or worse, being sent to the ergastulum, an underground prison reserved for slaves, where survival meant enduring darkness and overcrowding. Historians still argue whether ergastula were common in private villas or reserved mostly for agricultural estates, but either way, their existence underlines how normalized imprisonment had become. And then there was the role of the mistress. Popular fiction paints her as either complicit or victimized, and the truth is messier. Some mistresses wielded cruelty to reassert their dominance, punishing enslaved women who drew the master's attention. Others, trapped in marriages without power, projected their frustration onto the only people they could control. Enslaved women became scapegoats for household tensions, suffering from both sides of the power equation. No marble frieze, no glowing fresco records their names. One doesn't need gore to understand how degrading this was. Imagine being required to smile while pouring wine for the man who might summon you later, knowing every guest sees you as fair game. Imagine being mocked by the very children you nurse. Imagine carrying a child to term and watching that child treated as another line in someone's estate ledger. Rome loved to call itself eternal, but it built its eternity on lives it considered disposable. And yet, even here, resistance whispered through the cracks. Some women swallowed herbs rumored to prevent conception. Historians still argue whether silphium, a now extinct plant, was the ancient world's birth control miracle. Others sabotaged duties in small ways, watering wine too heavily, misplacing a jewel, pretending ignorance of Latin. Tiny rebellions, easy to overlook, but each one a reminder that humanity had not been entirely erased. The villa glitters at dusk, torchlight reflecting off polished marble. Guests laugh at dirty jokes, the master claps for more wine, and the enslaved women move silently, carrying trays, adjusting cushions, waiting for commands. To the outside world, it looks like civilization at its peak. To the women inside, it feels like living in a gilded cage with no door. And somewhere in the silence of that villa, a thought brews. What if they stopped obeying, even for a moment? What if silence turned into defiance? Defiance in Rome is never simple. For an enslaved woman, even lifting her eyes too boldly can count as rebellion. Yet the pressure builds, and history shows that silence sometimes cracks into shouts. The empire prided itself on order, but it was a fragile order, stitched together by fear. And fear, as every empire eventually learns, is a thread that frays. The most famous example of revolt comes from Spartacus, but his army of gladiators overshadows the countless quieter resistances inside households. Imagine dozens of women scattered across villas, whispering strategies while scrubbing amphorae, or exchanging coded glances when guards weren't looking. A mainstream fact? Records show that female slaves occasionally poisoned their masters, slipping herbs into food or drink. To the Romans, it was treachery. To the women, it was likely the only weapon they had. Historians still argue whether these acts were isolated accidents or part of coordinated plots, but the very existence of suspicion terrified Rome's elite. The punishments for rebellion were spectacularly cruel, designed to scare others into obedience. Crucifixion along the roads, branding on the face, being forced to wear iron collars inscribed with, "If found, return me to my master." Rome treated runaway slaves the way modern cities treat missing pets posters and all. One quirky detail, some collars even included jokes with lines like, "I'm a slave, keep me safe, don't let me run away." Humor as humiliation dangling around someone's neck. But defiance wasn't always about daggers and escapes. Sometimes it meant refusing to surrender internally. Women carved symbols into walls, sang lullabies in their native tongues, or secretly passed on stories of their homelands. The empire could chain their bodies, but controlling memory was harder. Even fragments of identity became acts of rebellion. There were larger revolts too, echoing through the countryside. In Sicily, 2 massive slave uprisings shook Rome in the 2nd century BCE, led by men promising freedom, but fueled in part by women who rallied, fed, and sometimes fought beside them. Sources mention women carrying weapons, though Roman historians downplayed it as scandalous. After all, what could be more terrifying to a patriarchal state than women with swords? Historians still argue how significant women's roles were in these revolts, but the mere possibility unsettled Roman pride. Daily life offered smaller but sharper daggers of resistance. A mistress demands her hair be styled, and the slave girl deliberately tangles the comb. A master orders wine, and the slave pours it too thin. Laughter bubbles between them, the private kind only other slaves understand. These moments may seem trivial, but in an environment built on total control, even minor sabotage carries weight. Rome wanted obedience like clockwork. Every misstep was a crack in its facade. Of course, not all resistance ended in victory. Many were caught, punished, and erased from records. Yet even failure leaves a mark. Consider the story of Eunice, leader of the First Sicilian Revolt, said to have been inspired by visions from a goddess. Women in his ranks reportedly believed those visions too, holding faith that divine justice sided with the enslaved. Skeptics today dismiss it as superstition, but whether the goddess spoke or not, belief itself gave people the courage to act. Sometimes faith is rebellion. And then there were escapes. Rome's roads, ironically its pride, became lifelines for runaways. Some vanished into forests, others blended into city crowds. Notices were posted, rewards offered, but every successful escape spread rumors of hope. Imagine being trapped in a villa and hearing that someone somewhere had slipped the leash. That knowledge alone could ignite dreams of freedom. Still, the stakes were terrifying. Runaways caught could face flogging, mutilation, or death. Owners paraded punishments publicly, turning resistance into a spectacle of deterrence. It was theater, staged cruelty to remind everyone of the script. Rome as master, slaves as silent props. But theater cuts both ways. Every execution also reminded onlookers that rebellion was possible, that someone had dared to break the silence. Quirky detail again. In some cases, owners forced rebellious slaves to wear masks of shame, literal bronze faces bolted over their own. It was punishment turned costume, another grotesque reminder that Rome was an empire obsessed with appearances. Yet think of the irony. In trying to hide the defiance of their slaves, they made it glaringly obvious to all. By now, the listener may wonder how these women endured at all. The answer lies in resilience. Some survived by blending into routines, others by resisting outright. Both were strategies. Both carried risks. What tied them together was the unspoken truth that Roman order depended on their silence, and silence is never permanent. The villa could hold its walls, but whispers travel, hopes spread, and defiance grows in secret. And somewhere, in one of those villas, a slave girl listens to the master snore and thinks about the knife she sharpened earlier. She does not know if she will use it, or if fear will tie her hands. But the thought alone changes her. Rebellion doesn't always begin with blood, it begins with imagination. And imagination is already slipping past the locks Rome forged. The empire that bragged about its marble monuments rarely admitted what truly propped them up. Lives consumed and discarded without ceremony. When we follow the trail of enslaved women through Roman history, the end is never neat. There are no monuments with their names, no triumphant inscriptions carved in stone. Instead, their legacy lingers like shadows cast across the empire's achievements, present, unacknowledged, but impossible to erase. The echoes survive in Roman law. Even long after the Republic gave way to empire, codes reinforce the ownership of enslaved women's bodies and labor. A mainstream fact, the Lex Aelia Sentia of 4 CE laid out harsh restrictions on manumission, making it harder for slaves under a certain age to gain freedom. This meant young women, even if favored or trusted, could remain trapped longer, with their hopes for release pushed far into the distance. Historians still argue whether these laws were motivated by a genuine fear of too many freed people diluting Rome's citizen body, or simply by elites wanting to tighten their grip. Either way, the women caught in this system had no voice in the debate, though it defined their futures. In daily memory, their traces appear almost accidentally. Graffiti in Pompeii mentions slave girls by name, sometimes mocking them, sometimes declaring affection. A scratched message like, "Eutychus was here," survives centuries longer than her actual life. One quirky detail, archaeologists have even found stylized doodles of women carrying amphorae, drawn perhaps by bored servants on villa walls. These little sketches, dismissed as vandalism by their owners, are among the only first-hand marks enslaved women left behind. Imagine being denied history's pen, yet still sneaking in a line or two when no one is watching. Their silence also shaped culture. Roman comedies often mocked female slaves as gossipy or cunning, turning them into caricatures that audiences could laugh at while ignoring the real suffering behind the masks. That stage laughter carried forward, influencing later European theater and stereotypes of servant women. Even now, when we picture maids in historical dramas, echoes of those Roman caricatures linger. Funny how exploitation gets recycled as entertainment, but not all legacies are invisible. Christianity, rising in the later empire, borrowed much of its imagery from the lived realities of slavery. Words like redemption and deliverance carried weight precisely because people knew what bondage meant. Enslaved women filled early congregations, their experiences shaping how salvation was imagined. Historians still argue whether Christianity genuinely improved their conditions or merely offered spiritual consolation. but the imprint remains undeniable. The language of faith was forged in part by their suffering. And yet, the deeper legacy is not in texts or laws, but in the haunting realization that Rome's greatness rested on their silence. Every polished marble block laid in the Colosseum, every banquet hosted by senators, every poem recited in candlelight, all of it leaned on the labor of women who cooked, cleaned, endured, and rarely spoke. Civilization for Rome was a pyramid balanced on the backs of the forgotten. Picture it, the ruins today, sunlit and quiet, tourists shuffling across ancient stones with cameras clicking, guides recite dates, emperors' names, battles won. Few mention the women who swept these floors, who were traded in these forums, who cried in these bedrooms. Their stories don't fit neatly into timelines, but they hover nonetheless, like whispers under the tourist chatter. Rome is dead, but the silence of its enslaved still vibrates. And if you listen carefully, you realize the silence isn't empty. It's heavy, pressing, demanding to be remembered. To ignore it is to repeat Rome's arrogance, glorifying marble while erasing flesh. The horrific truth behind closed doors was never just about cruelty in the moment. It was about erasure, about teaching entire societies to forget the women whose work made everything else possible. That forgetting is its own violence. The villa gates close one final time in our story, and behind them lie countless lives lived in service, in struggle, in survival. Some resisted, some endured, some vanished without a trace. All left behind a weight Rome never fully reckoned with. The empire called itself eternal, but eternity belongs to memory, and memory, once uncovered, cannot be silenced again. The aftershocks of Rome's slavery system didn't vanish with the empire's collapse. They rippled forward, shaping medieval law, colonial practices, and even the modern economy. When later societies justified owning human beings, they often pointed back to Rome, holding up its grandeur as proof that slavery could coexist with civilization. That's a bitter legacy for the women whose lives were consumed in silence, their suffering used as precedent rather than warning. In personal memory, too, their presence lingers. Roman household shrines sometimes included little figurines of slaves, not as honored ancestors, but as decorative echoes of service. Imagine being so integral to a family's life that you're immortalized, yet still nameless. Historians still argue whether these figures symbolized affection or mere possession, but either way, the enslaved women became icons of obedience rather than remembered individuals. It's worth pausing on the scale. Rome enslaved millions over centuries, yet the stories of women surface only in fragments. A court document here, a satire there, a tomb inscription noting a freed woman's gratitude. These scraps are not enough to rebuild their biographies, but they are enough to remind us that they were everywhere, cooking, nursing, sweeping, enduring. Silence is not absence, it is evidence of erasure. Quirky remnants turn up in language itself. The Latin word familia once meant not only blood relatives, but also the enslaved members of the household. Our modern word family hides within it a shadowed origin, a structure built on both love and bondage. Few people think about that when using the word, yet the echo remains, a faint reminder of how Rome's domestic order was never as innocent as nostalgia paints it. So when the empire's stones crumble and its statues topple, the weight of those unspoken lives still presses forward. The story of Rome's enslaved women is not just about the past. It's about recognizing how much of history is written by those with power and how much still waits to be uncovered in the voices deliberately silenced. The journey pauses here in a softer register where the noise of markets and the cries inside Roman villas fade into something distant, like echoes traveling through stone corridors that no longer exist. The images of the women you have followed, their footsteps on marble floors, their whispers in kitchens, their tears swallowed in silence, begin to dissolve into a gentler twilight. The horrors described do not remain to disturb your rest. They become threads of memory that now lie still, woven into the fabric of history, but no longer demanding struggle from you. Take a slower breath. Let it linger at the top, then release it quietly. The empire, once deafening in its authority, is gone. Its laws are broken tablets, its senators nothing more than names etched on crumbling lists. Yet the enslaved women we remembered tonight do not vanish with the empire. They persist in memory, No longer possessions, no longer shadows. They are witnesses to a truth Rome itself tried to bury, that every civilization, no matter how glittering, rests on the backs of those it refuses to acknowledge. And yet memory is not cruelty. It is not another chain. Memory is gentler, asking nothing but recognition. In recalling them, you offer something Rome never did, the dignity of being seen. That act alone softens the narrative from torment into release. The auction blocks, the collars, the punishments, all of those dissolve now into the distance. What remains is only a quiet presence, a sense that they are finally freed from silence. Let the stillness expand. Imagine walking through the ruins of a Roman villa at dusk. Tourists have gone home. The air is cooling, and birds settle in the olive trees. The columns still stand, but they are fractured, softened by centuries of rain. You place a hand on the stone and feel nothing but coolness. The walls no longer remember cruelty in their texture. They are neutral now, emptied of command, awaiting only the footsteps of the curious. In that emptiness, the enslaved women who once moved endlessly through these spaces no longer toil. They rest. Their labor is finished. Their voices, suppressed in life, drift out now as whispers carried on the evening wind. You do not need to strain to hear them. You only need to accept that they are part of the world's memory, part of the silence that surrounds you. That silence is no longer heavy. It is calm. Let the calm wash further. Every whip cracked, every command shouted, every tear swallowed is behind them now. What they could not choose in life, they gain in death. Release from obligation, release from fear. Their stories, uncovered centuries later, no longer chain them. Instead, they are fragments, like tiny lights scattered across a vast darkness, guiding us to remember with tenderness instead of forgetting in indifference. So as you rest tonight, you can let their weight slip from your shoulders. You have carried their story long enough to honor it, and that is sufficient. What remains is softness, a settling into stillness. Their chains are broken, their silence undone. You are left only with the quiet, and the quiet is safe. Allow that quiet to expand until it fills the room. Each sound outside the hum of a fan, the faint shuffle of night becomes part of the same hush that stretches back 2,000 years. The empire has fallen, and with its fall comes peace. You do not need to imagine suffering anymore. You need only breathe, slowly and steadily, until your own body feels as weightless as those ruins under the moonlight. The story ends not with cruelty, but with calm. The women who were once erased are remembered, and their memory now dissolves into silence that soothes rather than wounds. Let that silence carry you toward rest, where history's sharpness cannot follow. And in time, when you wake again, another forgotten corner of the past will be waiting another story, another voice, another shadow, ready to be brought gently back into the light.